Here we go with the second section of Chapter 9, looking at techniques to evaluate investment projects, purchasing property, plant, equipment, investing in research and development to develop new products, and potentially buying part or all of another company. All right, so we're going to look at internal rate of return, and this is another acceptable technique. So we really like net present value first and foremost because it takes into consideration the cash flows, the time value of cash flows, the risk of cash flows, how much value a project might create. And then we have net internal rate of return, which is a second technique which is also acceptable to us. So what is the internal rate of return? Well, theoretically what it does is it equates the present value of cash inflows and cash outflows. Okay, so the net present value is measured and is communicated, conveyed in terms of dollars, an amount of money. The internal rate of return is measured, is conveyed as a percentage, not as a dollar amount, but as a percentage return. All right? So using the internal rate of return as your discount rate in your net present value equation would result in a net present value of 0. So the internal rate of return is what you earn in terms of a percentage rate of return, and you compare that percentage rate of return to your discount rate to determine whether or not you pursue a project. So again, you pursue the project if the discount rate, if the internal rate of return meets or exceeds your discount rate, your required rate of return, okay, your IY. All right, so how do we compute the internal rate of return for a project? Well, if you don't have a financial calculator, then finding the discount rate that results in a 0 present value of cash flows, your net present value, is a trial and error process. In other words, you value your cash flows using different discount rates, different IYs, until your net present value is 0. Remember, net present value is the present value of cash outflows minus the present value of cash inflows. So if your net present value is positive, that means your discount rate has to move up in order for you to bring your positive cash flows down. If your net present value is negative, it means your discount rate is too high and it needs to come down. Okay? However, fortunately, we have our handy, inexpensive Texas Instruments BA2 Plus $30 calculator, and it will do an internal rate of return for us. All we have to do is input the cash flows. So let's go ahead and go through that process of inputting cash flows. So CF0 is minus 165,000, and so let's go through that process. Here are our cash flows for you to go ahead and enter into your calculator. All right, so we enter our 4 cash flows, the negative cash flow at time 0, and then the 3 positive cash flows. Once we do that, we hit IRR. Don't hit NPV. We're not calculating NPV. We are calculating the internal rate of return. What discount rate makes the value of these cash inflows equal to the present value of these cash outflows? And it's 16%. So let's look at this. Here's what happens. Look at this graph. This is IY, and these are our this is our net present value up here. So at a discount rate of 0, the project that we've been going over with the cash flows has a net present value of 60,000. Well, as we increase our IY, our net present value goes down, and so we keep on increasing our IY until we get to 16, a little over 16%, and that is where our net present value becomes 0, and that is our internal rate of return. This is what we're actually earning on this project, 16.13%. Okay? This is called a net present value profile for a project. So what are the advantages of the internal rate of return? Well, it does factor in the time value of money, and it specifies a percentage return, which a lot of people like. Rather than a dollar amount, people like to see what their percentage return is. We don't have to have a required rate of return to compute an internal rate of return, but we do have to have a required rate of return to compare our internal rate of return against. Okay? But we don't have to have that required rate of return. And often if we're looking at a project that has an extraordinarily high internal rate of return, then we'll go ahead and do the project, okay, without having to calculate a required rate of return. Now, disadvantages of the internal rate of return is that it does not quantify the dollar value added by a project. Let me put it to you this way. The net present value shows us how many dollars of free cash flow we are generating. The internal rate of return tells us how efficiently we are using our money. But think about it this way. If we were looking at a project, let's say we were a big company, we're looking at a project, and it generates a total amount of cash flow that is 5% of our existing free cash flow. It has an extremely high internal rate of return, but it only generates a very small amount of additional cash flow. Is that a project that we are willing to spend a lot of time on? Or would we rather work on a project that might not have as high a rate of return, as high of an internal rate of return, but let's say it adds 40% to our free cash flow? Wouldn't we be better off spending our time on a bigger project that generates a lot more cash flow? So that's one of the problems with the internal rate of return. So, like net present value, you do have to have a required rate of return so you can decide whether to do a project. And then there are problems with non-conventional cash flows, and we will look at that in more detail in section 3 of this chapter. And then there are problems with mutually exclusive projects. So in section 3, we'll look at the problems with the internal rate of return. So let's go ahead and take a look at, let's summarize what we've got so far. So far, under the net present value, we do the project. Under payback method, we rejected the project. And under the internal rate of return, we accepted the project. So notice that both methods that take time value of money into consideration generate the correct answer, which is to accept this project. All right, so that is the end of this very short clip. And now we're going to go into the problems with the internal rate of return. Shalom. Peace. Close up. Close up.